Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hello, Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. Dennis Rimmer here. With us today we have from probably in the Prince Albert area, John McDonald. Is that right, John? You're in the Prince Albert area right now?
Just north of Prince Albert, halfway between Prince Albert and Waskesiu, so out in the bush.
Okay, out in the bush. That's a good place to be. Tell us about your early life before we get to talking about Kitotam, your latest book. So you grew up in the same area, did you?
I grew up, actually, I was born and raised in Prince Albert. The first 14 years of my life was spent in the West Flat of PA. Even when I was in residential school, my residential school overlooked the West Flat. So the first 14 years of my life I was born and raised in the West Flat of PA.
And when did you start writing?
Oh, geez. I started writing probably in my teens. I was kind of a failed musician as a young man. And so I started writing, lyrics and songs and such, and then they slowly morphed into spoken word pieces, performance art pieces. So the work in the book, the style of writing that I do, I probably started in my late teens, early 20s as performance art pieces, spoken word pieces.
And the book is Kitotam, and it means in the Plains Cree language, what does it mean?
Well, the word Kitotam, it means he speaks about it, or that they're addressing it, they're talking about it, or they're addressing it.
And in the book, you are addressing what subjects?
Talking quite a bit about, the first part of the book is talking about my life growing up in the late 80s, early 90s in Prince Albert, touching on, my life and my experiences as an Indigenous kid growing up in the city of Prince Albert, growing up in the West Flat, growing up, not a lot of money with not a lot of hope, not a lot of future thinking, and just sharing some of those experiences of growing up like that. And then the second part of the book is more esoteric, more exploring words, playing with words, talking about my influences, talking about being on stage, and geared towards more of the spoken word performance art pieces.
And it's Kitotam, and it's a book of poetry by John McDonald from Radiant Press in Regina. So how did you team up with Radiant Press? How did that come about?
Well, it came about through Linda Monahan. She had suggested that I submit the manuscript to them. Prior to last year, I'd gone through about 20 years and about 215 rejection letters. I'd originally been published back in 2004. Got my 15 minutes of fame back then on the literary scene for that, and then everything kind of went quiet, and was sending out manuscripts to various publishers across Canada and around the world, and was getting rejection after rejection after rejection, and was ready to give up. And I had this manuscript that Linda Monahan, who was the writer in residence at the time at the John M. Cullner Public Library, she'd offered to do an edit read on it. And so she read it, and she said, "Hey, would you consider, have you ever thought about submitting this to Radiant Press?" And I said, no, I hadn't. So she said, send it in, give it a shot. And so I sent it in, and they loved it. So.
And that's a great story, because for a lot of writers, it seems to be the way it goes. You just get one rejection after another, after another, after another, and then the right door opens at the right time, and there you are, a published author. So it must have been a good feeling to finally get that acceptance.
It was a feeling of, I don't want to say vindication, but it was a feeling of, as a writer, it's hard to describe. Actually, it was a sense of, it's hard to put into words what it feels like. It's to go through that much rejection, to have those many doors slammed in your face, and then to have finally one open. The feelings, like I said, as a writer, it's hard to describe.
Yep, it's a feeling of maybe vindication, like you said, and finally acceptance and sort of a feeling that, wow, my work actually is worth something to people other than myself. Do you have any other books planned?
Actually, yeah, I've got quite a few coming out. Just prior to the release of Kitsotam, I'd had 6 months before, I'd actually had a publication, a book come out through Bookland Press called Childhood Thoughts in Water. I've got another book coming out with Bookland Press in September. It's more of an experimental book of prose that I've kind of been working on. It takes several different long monologue speeches and performance art pieces that I've performed live over the years and kind of put into a book very reminiscent of William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch. So this long stream of consciousness that really doesn't connect. It connects, but very loosely and is very all over the place. So it's a very experimental piece of work. It's called Electricity Slides, and it's coming out in September from Bookland Press. And coming up at some point next year, my first piece of nonfiction work will be published by Woolsack and Wynne. So to go from 20 years of nothing to, book after book after book after book.
That's right. And we're talking with John McDonald, September of 2021. The next book will come out, and then a slew of them after that. John McDonald, you're of Plains Cree descent, a sixth-generation descendant of Chief Mistawasis. How did you trace that back?
It's, common family knowledge. As a residential school survivor, I'm very, I recognize the privilege that I've been able to maintain with my family, the connection to our heritage and to our lineage. And it's, in our family, it's something we've always been proud of. And my, Chief Mistawasis is my great-great-great-grandfather. And so I've had that, that connection since, for my whole life, to be able to connect with my elders in my community and to touch base with them and say, this is your lineage.
That's wonderful, and it seems to be the thing that, a lot of, let's say, baby boomers seem to be doing these days. They're into genealogy in a big way, but you kind of grew up knowing all of that long before the invention of Ancestry and .com and that kind of thing, so that's a great story. What was I going to say? The book is a Kitsotam, and it's a collection of poetries. You have two segments, like you said, the winter place, a wintering place, and he wrote it all down based on two segments. And I've got a couple of questions about some poems in there. You've got some tributes, they're side by side to Mr. Dress Up and Maya Angelou. And what are those about?
Well, the Ode to Mr. Dress Up was, if you grew up in the 80s in Canada, you have that connection. But particularly for those of us that only had two channels growing up,
exactly.
Your morning routine was Mr. Dress Up Sesame Street and then the Flintstones at lunchtime. So when Mr. Dress Up passed away, it was kind of that was something that really affected a lot of my generation, and it was something that shortly after he passed away, we had September 11th.
Right.
Within a few days of it happening. So it was something where we had this loss and then this major epic, life-changing, world-changing catastrophe that happened. So that one was an opportunity for me to, just sharing my thoughts and my feelings about Mr. Dress Up, about, that aspect of my childhood growing up. Like I said, I grew up in a residential school. And so to come from a very dark place and to have that little spark of creativity once a day, that little light at the end of the tunnel every day, really, was one of the things that kept me going. The Maya Angelou part of the poem was a tribute to her. It was a tribute to the work that she provided, and working in an elementary school and talking with young people, and you ask the question, what does a poet do? Well, she writes poems. What are poems? Well, that's what poets write. That's the, just that in itself, that beautiful simplicity that came from the mind of a child, and it was very fitting, and I want to capture that.
And also, you have a tribute again to famous Prince Albert and Saskatoon radio TV personality Jack Sennan. So you were on his radio show, were you, way back when you were a youngster?
Once upon a time, it was 1989, 1990, something like that. I was in grade 2, and it was around Remembrance Day time, and it was at Princess Margaret's School, and we had had a poetry contest or something, and I'd written this poem. And suddenly I remember the teacher taking me, into this room and making a couple phone calls, and all of a sudden I'm being taken to down on Central Avenue. It used to be called Orpheum Theater, Tobacco Square, right on Central Avenue, going up into this sound booth. And there's this guy who I'd seen a couple times on TV. There was a time he did a commercial for Crescent Heights Pharmacy where he played both an old man in a bathrobe and then a baby in a pram, right, getting covered in baby powder. And that's where I recognized this guy. And then all of a sudden I'm wearing a set of headphones and he's asking me questions and asked me to read my poem. And that was my first media spot back in the very late 80s.
And you said residential school. Now, were you a full-time residential school person or daytime, or how did that work?
I was in residential school from 1984 to 1989. I was at the Prince Albert Indian Student Residence. So I was there, I was there from the age of 4 to the age of 9. I was there.
And that still has, I assume, an effect on you to this day?
It does, and it's as we go forward, and as the graves are being rediscovered across Canada, and we're starting the healing process. I'm very fortunate that I've been able to begin the healing process within myself, to reconnect with survivors, to have that sense of acknowledgement. Our generation of residential school survivors, we're kind of the forgotten generation, as it were, because you look at what gets presented from residential schools. It's black and white photographs from the 1950s and 60s.
Right.
The last residential school in this province closed in 1996, and like I always say, when the year I left residential school was the first year of The Simpsons. The year that the last residential school closed, Friends was in its 3rd season. The Spice Girls were making music, and it's not just black and white history. There are survivors here who, our generation, our stories also need to be shared. So I'm very fortunate that I've been able to connect with other survivors and have that acknowledgement and that recognition that yes, what we went through, our experiences are validated.
Exactly. And John McDonald is with us. The book is Kitotam, Kitotam. A couple other poems to talk about. So Sick of Beads. Give us a rundown on that one, please, because it seems quite heartfelt, and I understand the frustration behind that poem. I think I understand it.
That came from a sense of trying to reconnect with my culture, but at the same time watching what was being done with it. A lot of times Indigenous culture gets, when you hear those words, Indigenous artist, when you hear Indigenous art, there are certain things that go right to, a person's mind. It's eagle feathers and buffalo skulls and totem poles and the end of the trail and beaded this and that and everything. And it was written at a time where I was experimenting as an artist, doing mixed medium stuff, doing abstract art, and trying to find a foothold in the art world. But as soon as people would say, well, he's an Indigenous artist or an Aboriginal artist, right away, well, are you going to paint buffalo skulls? Are you going to do there was this misconception that the first thing I was going to do was present Indigenous art, and I was trying very best to say I'm an artist who just happens to be Indigenous as opposed to an Indigenous artist. And it was a time when we were just starting to see the whole appropriation of Indigenous culture. You had, the Coachella princesses, as I call them, the the young white women that wear headdresses to music festivals in the States. You had like Halloween Spirit. You had these Halloween stores that were selling indigenous culture as Halloween costume.
Right.
You had a lot of new age hippy dippy people taking indigenous culture and appropriating it to their own ends. And I was getting mad. I was getting frustrated, and I was trying to, in that poem, trying to show that our culture is more than just beads. And I mentioned it, the introduction of those beads started with a bad business deal on Manhattan Island way back when.
Right.
And it's gone from there. And, even to this day, Halloween's coming up. If you go into some of these Halloween stores, these ones that pop up in empty storefronts, you're more than likely going to find a very sexually provocative woman's costume, or you're going to find a headdress. You're going to find, all these, this cultural appropriation going on. And at the same time, we do have that where there was a time growing up where everything got beaded. People were beating cigarette lighters. People were beating bingo dabbers. It was everywhere. And it was, starting to look at some of the history of it, particularly things that, and this went right back to the 60s and 70s, the whole idea of a beaded headband started in Hollywood so that the extras who were doing the stunts could keep their wigs on. If they were non-Indigenous people playing Indigenous characters in all these westerns and stuff, and they had these long braided wigs on, they would wear these headbands on their heads to keep the wigs on their heads while they were riding horses. So it was an acknowledgement of that, where I was just getting tired of the appropriation over and over and over again.
And that was So Sick of Beads is the poem in Kitotam, and also Meditation on the Res. That's interesting because, the way you portrayed it was completely a new thought to me. Is like, oh yeah, it seems like a big area, but it's still kind of fenced in. So it's just like I think as you put it, if I'm reading it or interpreting it, just like a giant outdoor prison, more or less.
In terms of, that comes from a point of looking at for young people who are growing up on the res, who are growing up on reserve, where you don't have a lot of opportunities, where you don't see a lot of future, where you don't see a lot of forward momentum. It can feel like that. It can feel like, this is as far as life is going to go. And it also, it not only in terms of, being on a First Nation, being on the reserve, but, coming from my own experience growing up in the West Flat for the first 14 years of my life, my entire existence was, that little couple blocks of Prince Albert that were, there was a predominantly Indigenous community. And that was where I thought my whole life was going to be. I was born there. That's where I was going to die. This is my world. And I didn't have an opportunity at that time to expand upon that. And how much of that was within myself, just based on what was going on around me. And since that poem has been written, I look back at, some of the major steps forward that are happening in our communities, in First Nations communities, where we have, I look at what, Mistawasis has been in the news quite a bit for, the discovery of the graves at the former residential school. But, you look at Mistawasis, they're among the leaders in clean energy right now, with solar farms, with wind farms. They're making tremendous strides towards, the future green energy. So my hope is that at some point, our young people who are on reserve, who are in Indigenous communities, who have, who feel like this is it, like you're kind of institutionalized within the world surrounding you, that they have an opportunity to get out of that world, get out of that mentality that this is all there is. And we look at some of the what's going on Facebook right now with young people who are making TikTok videos, who are using the new medium to express themselves, to open those doors. It is exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing more of it.
And this is John McDonald. And before we close, John, just a little bit, maybe on a bit of the lighter side. July of 2000, you were in England, and what did you do over there?
Well, I was awarded a scholarship to study history at the University of Cambridge. And during that trip, I symbolically discovered and claimed England for the first peoples of the Americas. I was there on a history scholarship and understanding, that a lot of the history that we were taught in school of Columbus and Cartier and Cabot and, the Cortez and all these quote unquote explorers that were crossing the ocean and claiming and discovering land for the crown heads of Europe, in spite of the fact that, we as Indigenous people were here.
That's right.
It was me wanting to put the shoe on the other foot, as it were, and coming from this opportunity of being an Indigenous person returning to the land of the colonizers, I wanted to make a statement to that fact. And so on July 27th of 2000, wearing a buckskin jacket, the very Hollywood Indian portrayal of an Indigenous person, and using a flag that was kind of synonymous with Indigenous protest at the time, which was a Canadian flag with this image of a chief holding a pipe on it. I walked into this crowd of people in the middle of a very busy park in downtown Queen's College Park in the University of Cambridge, and here's this image of this guy in this long buckskin jacket, braided hair, eagle feathers in his hair, and carrying this giant flag. And I said, I come here, a visitor from across an ocean. I see a people with their own language, with their own culture, with their own government, their own religion, building society, but in the tradition of Cartier, of Columbus, of Cabot, of Cortez, and all these explorers that came to my homeland. None of this existed till I got here. And this is ours now, and I claim it for the first peoples of the Americas. So it was an opportunity to, like I said, put the shoe on the other foot and show that what we were taught as history isn't exactly true. And you can't claim something when somebody was already there. And you can't take ownership of something when somebody was already there. So,
yep, that's what we were taught. And like they say, you can't do better unless you know better. So finally, we're starting to realize some of these things, hundreds of years after the fact. But I think it's slowly sinking in. John McDonald has been with us. The book is Kitotam, that's Kitotam. It's from Radiant Press out of Regina, Saskatchewan. John, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And hopefully, people who buy the book, they enjoy it and tell their friends. Support poetry in this province, support literature in this province. Unfortunately, in Prince Albert, we don't have a bookstore anymore, so we have to go to Saskatoon to buy books. So if you're fortunate enough to still have a bookstore in your community, visit it and buy books, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.